Okay, so I am Kathy Hilton. This is Jenny Skillin. I'm in the UK. Jenny's in Australia. We're having a conversation and we thought it was worth recording. We hope it turns out to be valuable to other people. We're having a conversation about methods for the production of food in the context of global food crisis, basically. Trying to establish some food security for individuals and families. I'm going to give a little bit of my context and then ask Jenny for a little bit of context as to why she's interested in this conversation, and then we will go on to what we hope is some valuable information. So from my point of view, I was working as a designer until about 3 years ago. I had a company. I developed a process for printing on wood, and I was very proud of my process. I was very proud of the collection that I'd produced. And I was finding it extraordinarily hard to make the business work to earn a living. And I hit a wall. And in my kind of enforced stopping through hitting a wall, I was looking at how hard I had to work to make the business work and whether it was worth it, and the impacts more broadly than just for myself. And within that, I became clear that from an ecological perspective, my business, my attitude, my life was exactly part of the whole root of the ecological crisis and the ongoing escalating climate emergency, because I was producing products that weren't essential. I was producing nice kitchenware. And so to make the products, they were wooden, so trees were being chopped down, petrochemicals were being used in the production process. I was using vinyl film that was a waste product, excuse me, that couldn't be recycled. So all of that was polluting, but worse than that, in my perspective, any marketing that I did, and I had to do marketing to make the business, to make sales, any marketing that I did was a total psychological manipulation. It was manipulating people into believing that they had to buy things. They had to buy things to be happy. They had to buy things to gift to people. They had to buy things to be satisfied. And that really distressed me. It really distressed me how much I was contributing to that global reality of buying things is a fundamental part of who we are and how we connect with each other, how we love each other. Because fundamentally it was all taking from the earth's resources, and that taking from the earth's resources is what has created the climate emergency that we have. So I felt, once I saw this, I felt I had no choice but to stop, which was pretty shocking to me and to people around me. Massive disruption in my life. And I then set off to try and understand Western psychology of affluent, privileged people who haven't done all that much to stop the climate crisis and who are largely, in my opinion, ignoring the climate crisis. I set out to understand the psychology of why we were doing that. That work took me to where I am today, which is concentrating on producing food, because as I see it, what I learned was kind of only going to be of interest to a few people. I started writing a book, then I thought it wasn't really worth it. Nobody much was going to care, but I have the expectation that the crisis will escalate quickly enough that food is going to be, we're going to be in a food emergency before we know it. So I put my focus into producing food for myself and for more people, which is where I'm at. And I met Jenny, really interesting woman. Jenny has an amazing ancient archaeological perspective to bring to all of this, and I love the wisdom that adds to what I see as there's a lot of information within the climate aware community around sustainability, around looking at living sustainable lives, producing our food in sustainable ways. But Jenny has a perspective that brings in a whole pile of ancient wisdom. And I'll stop and let Jenny explain herself. Jenny, would you like to explain your context for joining in this conversation?
Yeah, okay. I guess I also come from a design background. And my journey has been through art, and then later museums and museum studies, and then through furniture design and sort of learning about furniture design. And what I really wanted to learn about when I was studying furniture design was actually designing for sustainability, but that was actually quite tricky to get that training because it's not part of the mainstream design sort of training that you would receive normally. Maybe it's changed now, but it certainly wasn't the case when I was there. Anyway, I'm now working in the design field still, but it's very much for sustainability. Given that, I'm also studying archaeology, and I live in Australia. Studying archaeology in Australia and living in Australia has made me aware of quite a few things. And I can't speak for Aboriginal people in this, but what I can say is what I've learnt. So I'm just going to share what I have learnt from my perspective of looking at how people lived for more than 50,000 years on this continent, and then also looking at Europe and the UK, and the sort of the different way that people lived before farming, before agricultural communities, before agriculture became established as the main economy, when previously foraging economies were our whole 100% of human life. And that was actually sustainable.
Right.
Foraging combines a really broad range of activities, including planting and harvesting and, sort of planning food sources, planning food procurement. So it's definitely not, as most people think, just wandering about looking for food, and nor were people starving, hungry, and kind of thinking that they needed to find a better way of doing things. In fact, from archaeological evidence, we know that when people started farming, their diets were worse. They had worse health than they did prior to that. So foraging economies usually have a wide-ranging diet. They forage quite widely and gather things that are really nutritious. And so, yeah, the skeletal evidence from archaeology suggests that you can really tell the difference between a hunter-gatherer and a farming body. There's little from farming communities is that they had malnutrition. They had periods of time when they certainly did not get enough to eat. And so they were just not getting a broad enough diet. And so there were obvious effects to their health. There were also, from the work that women did grinding the wheat flour or whatever, the nodules on their spines and damage to their knees, and suggests that it was a lot of hard work,
Right.
you know, grinding all of that grain. And the other thing that's interesting is that the teeth of people in foraging economies usually were much better. Very few caries, didn't have significant damage because of grains, probably, because there are of course a type of sugar. So so anyway, that's one thing. Here in Australia, we know that even when it was drought, even when there were flooding rains, even when there were, there was bad weather or bad seasons, or even a number of bad seasons, people still had plenty of food, plenty. So it didn't, they just sort of, they knew where to look for the different food. And so that knowledge was passed on through oral traditions. It was recorded in poems, recorded in songs, it was told in stories. It was something that was known by everyone, and they would learn that as they grew up, and then pass that knowledge on. So, and in the UK, I'm just sort of like UK and Europe, during the Mesolithic, so prior to the Neolithic, prior to the farming takeover, the forests across England and Scotland had lots of nut trees, particularly hazelnuts and oaks, and sort of large forests of those kind of nutritious plant protein. And if you go to any of the 47 Scottish Mesolithic sites, all of them have charred hazelnut shells. So sort of they used to roast them, and it was part of their sort of diet, definitely part of their diet. And so, but they would have had a wide-ranging diet, fish, land animals, different greens and foraged vegetables, and so tubers and all sorts of things. So my thought is this: permaculture is really about, building food forests, and that sort of, I guess, little Switens and just sort of clumps of food within forests, but there's also the idea of urban gardens, you know, like food, perennial food plants, so fruit trees, nut trees, all those kind of different sorts of perennial trees grown in cities and towns and just out in the countryside, even where we rewild. My thought is that we are part of nature. People in the past did not see themselves as separate. They didn't say, we're not going in there. We can't, you know, they did actually protect certain areas if they were of very high biodiversity, and where there was the headwaters, they would protect that and not go there. But otherwise, the idea was that they would forage in different parts of the countryside. So each different ecosystem had food that you could go to and forage. We can create little mini gardens of those kind of things throughout the countryside and in our gardens as well, sort of like little mini ecosystems. But I think my thought is that because industrial agriculture now has such the chemical inputs, you know, the chemical pollution from industrial agriculture is one of the big things that is causing so much cancer and all sorts of other dreadful things. But also there's the loss of soil and the loss of biodiversity and the pesticides and all the other terrible things that come through agriculture. We don't really, I don't, yeah, I know there's regenerative agriculture, which is great. And I think that that's definitely got to happen, and including, you know, rewilding as part of that, the regenerative agriculture. So hedgerows and, you know, bringing back forests surrounding areas. But when we look at the landscape, it's almost like we have to see it the way that people here saw their landscapes, which was that they managed them to increase biodiversity, because in increasing the biodiversity, that meant there was more range of foods, of plants and animals, so that there was always going to be plenty to go around. So it wasn't that sort of reductionist method. It was a what's the opposite of that? It was whatever that is.
Yeah.
So abundance, that's it. It was an abundant method. So I think from my perspective, when I think about what to do, I know there's not enough time to grow massive forests of nut trees, but we should at least start to think about what kinds of plants we can put in wherever we can to actually set ourselves up so that if there is not food available in the shop or in your garden or wherever, there is food somewhere. So we have to just start seeing the world again as people did here, which was that they managed it in a mosaic landscape. So sort of more open areas where people could move around easily, and those areas were kept fairly clear, and in those areas they could actually hunt. And then other areas where it was forested, they would have plants in there that were useful to other animals and to themselves. And they would have animals in there that were useful to them also. And so it was a situation where the best spots on the land that were good for keeping the water in the soil,
Oh yeah.
they kept that sort of, kept it like that. And the other areas where that wasn't such a big deal, that was where they had the open spaces. So it was planned so that the whole landscape actually was managed. People always think that hunter-gatherers just wandered around.
Yeah.
No, they planned their whole landscape. It was a planned landscape. So this is the thing that people need to wrap their heads around a little bit. And I think when we think about rewilding, we should be thinking about putting ourselves in there too, like allowing other creatures to live and then living with them a little bit, not having them separate completely like a zoo, but like being able to interact respectfully. So that's my thoughts, because I just think there's actually, when you think about the earth, it's quite a large area. But the amount of soil loss and the amount of biodiversity loss, just even in the last 20, 30, 40 years, has been absolutely horrific. And if we can increase that in any way we can, I think we need to. So for me, that means going back to eating some of the things that we used to eat, foraging the weeds and the herbs and things that were traditional foods, maybe not necessarily just eating, the fruit and vegetables that are given to us as seed from Monsanto or whomever. Even the heritage seeds, those are a less selective group of foods than we used to eat. So just sort of expanding the range and reconsidering the plants in the landscape.
Okay, reconsidering the plants in the landscape. I see that. I'm thinking about the size of the world population. I'm thinking about different people's lifestyles. So some people will be living close to nature. Some people will be living in very urban environments. So people who are close to nature, it would be more straightforward to be engaging with wild landscapes or managed landscapes. So I've got two questions. Is it realistic that how much food could be produced, and does it get anywhere near feeding urban populations, and also what can individuals be doing to move to those opportunities, move to the opportunities of eating wild food. So I've just had my first season of food growing, first time gardener, and I have appreciated how extremely labor intensive it is to be growing the normal vegetables that are popular in my culture. And I know that permaculture is much more about assisting nature in producing the crops that will thrive without a huge amount of attention and effort. And I know that food forests is a concept of producing and of assisting a landscape in producing food that people will want to eat. But I wonder what you could tell us about actions that can be taken by people who are living close to nature already, and what about the scale of the issue given the amount of land we have now available and the huge numbers of people who are living nowhere near nature.
Yeah, look, it's tricky. Obviously, foraging groups were much smaller groups in much larger areas. However, my thought is this: even in urban areas, there are actually lots of green spaces usually that people don't even notice them. There's strips of little strips down the sides of streets and verges and little areas of the sides of parks and the different flower beds and all sorts of things that are there. There's also in cities, there are balcony gardens, there's rooftops, there's all these different spaces up high that can be found to grow things. And I know that, for example, there are restaurants who are growing food for their kitchens down, up on the top of their roof. They're also they have beehives and things up on the roofs. So, I think it's more just a question of looking around and seeing what spaces there are. Also, I would say get out a foraging book from the library, or start learning from the internet about foraging. Go on a foraging tour with somebody who knows what they're doing, and really start learning about the kinds of foods that are actually growing out there right now that you don't know about because we have been trained out of eating them, but they are there. Our ancestors ate them, and we're here because they ate them.
My experience, whenever I've eaten anything that's growing wild as opposed to has been cultivated, is you can just tell the nutritional density, the nutritional quality in that
absolutely
food is on a different level. It's like people will know the difference between processed food and fresh vegetables. They'll be able to sense the greater nutrition in fresh vegetables, but it's a whole other level again, and so incredibly good for the body, because you only need less volume to get your nutrients, so you're taking in less calories. Your body is kind of harmonizing.
That's exactly right. Yeah.
It's really interesting.
Yeah. Yeah. So because most of our landscapes across the globe have been sort of, I'm going to use the word bastardized now, because they've got all these imports from other countries. They've also got, you know, sort of what we consider to be weeds, and so on and so forth. But
Yeah.
of course, a lot of weeds are actually the sort of things that people ate before, because they grew without any assistance, right?
Okay.
So if you're not a farmer, if you're a forager, they're the thing, because they thrive on neglect. So that's exactly what would have been, you know, just able to be picked wherever you were. So a lot of those plants are still there. They're out there in the environment, and we just have to find them, start looking after them, you know. And I think so, you know, don't pick the whole thing, rip the whole thing out, like actually treat the plants with respect, and just pick what you need, and sort of start looking after those as resources, as things that we need to care for, and teach other people about it too. So it's like, once people are aware that these things are there, then all of a sudden more is made of them. Do you know what I mean? And there's been a shift, I know, away from mowing lawns to the no-mow lawns, you know, where you can just mow a path and leave the rest of your garden to have flowers and things for butterflies and whatever. But your lawn will also have food in it you can eat if you look carefully enough. So this is the kind of thing, like, there's actually food out there. It's just about thinking differently, and we need to train ourselves to start thinking about food being around us in the landscape, and us being part of nature again, because we are not separate. We are not you know, we're not actually a farming animal.
Right.
Farming is a 12,000-year-old invention, and we're actually a foraging animal from a long time back, a couple of million years, in fact, of foraging.
Interesting.
Yeah, so foraging requires a different way of being. It requires a way of care for the land, like responsibility to manage it correctly, and not to overharvest, not to take more than you need, not to yeah, just to be more in tune with it.
Yeah. I can see totally the value. I'm thinking of what a challenge it is for modern humans to make that shift. I'm thinking how most people's lives won't allow them the time to, they'd regard such an exploration as a luxury that they don't have time for. But I'm also really, really conscious of our current global economic situation. And I want to say a bit about that, because I think on the whole, people are really, really unaware of what many people who are paying attention are thinking is inevitable over, let's say, the next decade. So we're recording this in July 2022. Food price increases are evident. Considerable food price increases are evident. So people are starting to worry about it. And obviously we've had COVID, the world shut down. So a lot of the commentary on it all is that it is that the food price crises is a response just to a lot of industry shutting down through COVID. But I want people also to understand that we also have, obviously we've got the climate change crisis. And this is part of the climate change crisis. So every plant has its needs for particular amount of sunlight, amount of rainfall, amount of nutrients in the soil. Every plant has its criteria with which it thrives. And so it does well in particular parts of the world and wouldn't grow in other parts of the world in different climates. But we've got, I think in the last 20 years, there was double the amount of extreme weather events that there was in the previous 20 years. So things like extreme rainfall, extreme temperatures, extreme winds. So climate change is already happening. Extreme weather is increasingly happening, so crop failures are happening. At this point, there's a lot of media attention being paid to the grain that is stuck in the Ukraine. I'm not sure how much people are also aware that the Ukraine war has meant next year's wheat hasn't been planted. So even if we got the existing wheat out, we've got next year issues are already established. The other great wheat source for the world, North America, has had a really dry winter and a wet spring. So they've got a significant drop in yield because of unusual weather. Obviously, you've got a lot of foods start with wheat. So people may expect, as I talk to people, I see there's an expectation of an increase in food prices. There's an expectation in a bit less choice in the supermarket. That's the level of awareness I see as normal around me. But I feel like we have a set of dominoes and the first ones are falling, and there's not awareness of the other inevitabilities that we're now facing because of the chain reaction that we're in. So we're such a connected economy, an internationally connected economy, that something that causes a significant issue in one part of the world very easily causes spreads, causes crises in other parts of the world as well. And the global food supply system has become so, it's been efficientized. It's become so streamlined that it's now, I read of an interesting analogy with the financial systems, the global financial systems prior to the 2008 collapse. People who analyze systems look for the resilience of a system. So resilience is how well you can survive shocks. For a system to be resilient, it needs a lot of small players, because the small players will all have their individual characteristics, and some will be able to survive when circumstances are stressful and others collapse. If you've got a lot of small players, you'll have some that survive. The global financial industry had the characteristics of a lot of big players, not a lot of small players. Sorry, a few big players rather than a lot of small players. So it was a vulnerable system. And when it got stressed, there were collapses. There were significant collapses. So the food supply chain, global food supply chains now have those characteristics of a few huge players rather than a lot of small players. So the food supply chains are now not a resilient system. We're already seeing those first dominoes fall. We're set up for some other disastrous domino falls. And all of this is what was expected by people who applied their minds to climate change. So some people are saying it's just that there were the economic implications of the world shutting down because of COVID, or it's just a few bits of bad weather, or it's just the war in Ukraine. But this is all symptomatic of climate change. When you look at the concept of overshoot, which is so very valuable a thing to understand in all of this, because most of the attention that is applied to the climate crisis is about carbon. People are trying to lessen the amount of carbon put into the atmosphere. Even if we completely solve the carbon issue, which we won't, even if we did, the human relationship with nature is so predatory. It's so full of ourselves. We as a culture developed to the point where we believed we could just keep taking from nature and keep polluting nature, and nature would just keep supplying us. And we haven't understood the symbiotic nature that we have, the symbiotic relationship that we have with nature. We haven't understood that nature has a limit. Everything has a limit to the amount it can be polluted and the amount that it can be taken from before it suffers. This is the concept of overshoot. We are overshooting the levels that can be taken from the earth and can be polluted into the earth. The global population has massively escalated. The expectations of people alive today are phenomenal in comparison with previous generations. Most people of any degree of maturity, if they think about what they own in comparison with what their parents owned, often it'll be 10 times. And our whole economic system is based upon having to grow, growth being a good thing, but we're on a finite planet. So the people who govern us, the people who strategize, are completely there has to be buy-in. So for international economics, you have to be doing better than other countries. You have to be doing better than you were. You have to be producing more money and more products than you were and than your neighboring countries are, to be doing well in the global economic relationships. So the people who are governing us and making our plans are totally growth focused, but there's a limit to what the planet can take, and we are at that limit. But it's such a challenging thing to get your head around, because it's asking people to step out of so much of what our culture has indoctrinated us with, the understanding of what's essential. So it's essential that you form a family. It's essential that you have children to feel good about yourself. It's essential that you have a good money and a good career, but most careers are extractive in nature. Most careers somehow or other are taking things from the earth.
Mm-hmm.
So asking people to alter that mindset is generally asking people more than they're capable of at this point. which is why we have failed to halt the crisis. So we're continuing, we've reached this overshoot level and we're continuing past it. So the food crisis is a symptom of that much, much bigger picture. It's not just about COVID, it's not just about Brexit, it's not just about economists not managing inflation. We have to have a fundamental shift in our expectations for our lives, where our expectations are that we do well, where we get a nicer, bigger house and things, objects. We have to shift that attitude. And this is where an interest in foraging becomes not like hobby level, but a different, let me think exactly what I want to say here. I don't see any way that the food crisis is going to be paused or turned around. I don't see any way that, I mean, some people think they can handle the price increases, that people feel it's going to be an uncomfortable few years, but they can handle those price increases. But when you look at it from the context of increasing severe weather events, meaning increasing crop failures, the vulnerabilities of supply chains, and fundamentally overshoot, then this doesn't look like an uncomfortable few years as a response of COVID. This looks like late stage capitalism, the start of collapse. And so how are we going to live? What are we going to do? If things are collapsing, the dominoes fall very quickly. That means probably millions of people being plunged into poverty, millions of people probably having to leave the regions where they have been living and look for places where it is possible to grow food. Food still is growing. It's a very, very different way of life, you know? And the things we're trying to save right now really pains my heart, what we're trying to save, because we're just pushing the crisis down the road a few years when we have a chance to be making a difference right now and alleviating some of the distress that will come. And there's really little understanding of that. And I sit here and accept that I may be wrong and I may be alarmist and I may be I may have some of those details wrong, but I can't see where there's errors in that logic. It feels it feels inevitable, and it feels like other people aren't paying attention, and then it's distressing. It's distressing to be amongst people who aren't paying attention.
I agree with everything you've said. And to me, it feels like the whole idea of annual crops just isn't going to cut it, because we can't rely on those as staple foods. We need things that are really reliable, things like tubers. They grow under the ground much safer under there, to be honest. And quite often tubers have edible leaves as well, like sweet potato leaves, but also perennial, tree crops and perennial other crops. We need to be looking into those and looking at the climate that's coming for your area.
But can we know,
What
isn't that one of the
plants?
fundamental issues, that we've got no idea whether we're going to be massively hot or massively cold or massively wet or massively drier? Don't we have to try many different crops
Yeah,
with the
I think
expectation
that's
of we don't know which way it's going to go?
a big diversity. I think
Yeah.
increasing biodiversity of plants, and trying to sort of just have as much regeneration going on as possible so that we can have that resilience, because we can't rely necessarily on one crop or this crop. We need to plant those as well, but have other things available too, and just sort of try and get the amount of different things happening.
Yeah.
And it will become clear after a while which things are going to survive better than others. So,
And
but I think we
also,
have to be doing a wide range of things.
I agree, and I really want governments to be prioritizing this. I really want governments to understand that there's a real risk that within just a few years, people aren't going to be able to buy food. And so, obviously, when people don't get food, you've got phenomenal societal issues. People turn very violent very quickly without food. There are lessons that can be learned from refugee situations. So you've got refugee communities who have learnt masses about how to prepare food on the move, how to cook food, how to find different foods. My sense is, I don't know if this is, I don't hear other people saying this, so I don't know if I'm being blinkered here, but my sense is we're going to be looking at municipal catering situations within a decade. So councils, governments are going to need to be feeding populations, and they will wish. I did hear, I haven't checked it's true, but I did hear that Switzerland has set up a government department to plan energy cuts, power cuts, with the foresight that they will need to be cutting off power supplies frequently. So looking at how they're going to do that without how they're going to mitigate the impacts of that. So hospitals still having power supplies and what have you. So some governments, I understand, are planning at that level. I've been trying to raise this with my local council with no real engagement, no real understanding of what I'm trying to say. But I can't see it going any other way than thousands of people's food supply falling away without preparations having been made. So some people will be growing their own food. I know we've got a lot of people growing food and a lot of work going into growing food in my area, but there will still be millions of people who haven't been growing their own food, who will find themselves in absolute crisis situations. And there are preparations that can be made in terms of preparing to cook on industrial scales and provide nutrition. And I wish that people would be on the case with that.
Yeah, I think that sounds like a really good plan. I would have thought that the transition towns would be preparing for that sort of thing. No? Or are they?
Well, I did have an opportunity to hear a council leader of a transition town speaking off the record last month, and she was saying she does see this future and she can't bring it up in council meetings.
Yeah.
There isn't enough awareness yet for other people to be able to hear this and prioritize this ahead of other real current emergencies. So real current emergencies being people now in food crisis, cost of living crisis, housing crisis, economic crisis. So those are obviously real, valid, current emergencies. And they're tiny in comparison with what I feel is coming.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think what you're saying sounds like it's something that needs to be developed maybe outside of councils and governments, because they're just not listening.
Yeah.
They're not able to take it on board yet. So that might have to be a social enterprise kind of idea to develop. I think that the idea of the, urban food and victory gardens and all of that sort of thing. Like if you look at Cuba, they turned things around quite quickly.
Really? I don't know that history.
Oh yeah, have a read about Cuba, because they transformed city areas to like parks and gardens to food growing areas quite quickly. Same as in countries like Britain, where you're suddenly at war.
The war response.
Victory gardens were the thing. And so that whole idea of increasing regeneration and increasing areas of food, turning any bit of ground really into food. And I think that that brings me back to the Indigenous ideas here of what they call increase ceremonies, where they would actually get together when there was some sort of big like a bunya trees, the bunya nuts were all ripe. They would all come and have a couple of weeks or whatever of eating all of the food there, but while they were there, they would actually share with each other information about their particular totem, which was something in the environment there that they personally got to learn as much as they could about, and then they would share that with other people. So the idea of totems was not this fanciful thing. It was actually a really useful thing, because everybody had an individual totem. Then there were clan totems, tribe totems, etc., etc. And so the totems were a way of sharing knowledge with each other. They were also a way of stopping over harvesting, because if something was your totem, you couldn't eat that. Other people could. But you
I
couldn't.
didn't know that.
Yes. And so there was lots of laws, actually, lots and lots of rules about how to behave and how to not behave. And definitely, you know, the management of land and the way that you interacted with all of the parts of nature around you, that was all very much bound up in the culture. You know, nature was part of the culture. You couldn't just randomly do stuff. You couldn't go and pick stuff. If you picked things that were not ripe, or if you know, broke things that were whatever, that you know, if you damaged parts of the environment, you could be killed for doing the wrong thing, because it's a matter of looking after, of being held responsible. And we have lost that thing, and I think we need to grow it back, that we can, this is actually part of who we can be. We can be people who are who are actually caring for the land around us.
I do feel we'll get there. So as alarming as my views are, I also have huge love for and faith in humans. I feel like we have got ourselves into well, it's I'm reminded of my mother, who used to speak of a nun who educated her when she was tiny, talking about the pendulum swings. So we go from when we hit an extreme, we get the momentum to go back to another extreme. So the war, the first half of the 20th century was so devastated by mankind's behavior that out of that we were so engaged in developing security, wealth, family stability, growth, prosperous economies. I can see why we went into it with such determination and vigor, but we have got to this end of the pendulum swing where it has become ugly, and it's eating itself. It's in a really disgusting phase. Bad things are going to happen, but we're going to swing back with such a phenomenal momentum, turning our back on the bad aspects of capitalism. So all systems have their great aspects and their bad aspects. Capitalism has some real dark energy within it, and that's going to be seen through, and what's going to come out of that will be a phenomenal return to connecting with nature and to getting satisfaction and peace out of truly beautiful things, rather than through ownership, through having power over, through having status. So I do have faith in later outcomes, but I think we've got an enormously painful transition period ahead, and I wish that more people were engaged in that and preparing, because it makes a huge difference to how it will be experienced. I'm sure it doesn't take much thinking to understand, no matter how well I prepare for myself, if I'm surrounded by people who haven't prepared, I've achieved nothing. I've achieved nothing without community resilience. But community resilience requires it to be a matter of importance to people. It requires people to understand where we are at and why it's worthy of attention. And that's not happening. Hence we're making a video. Hence we're making a video to try and increase that awareness.
I think we can't do everything by ourselves, but we can do some things, and some of those things are learning about what we can do, trying to find other like-minded people and working with them on things, planting as much as we can wherever we can, because I think that whole idea of just regenerating is a good idea anyway, because we don't know what's going to survive and what won't, but let's just try. And also I mean, I think it's a great idea to let the forests regrow, like we're, is happening in sort of rewilding all over the place. I would like to see within that rewilding that some of the trees being planted, some of the plants being planted are ones that are edible for us. I just think that that is a really good idea, because that it might be useful later on. And also we need to think about seaweed. Seaweed is great food. That's another really super rich food.
Super full of nutrients, and all forms of seaweed are edible.
Yeah.
Some of them not so tasty, but they are all forms of nutrition.
Yep. And I think we've got to start thinking about other forms of protein, which is why I mentioned nuts, because nuts are such a great form of protein, plant protein. But yeah, the sort of the larger the life form with animals that we eat, the more that we're it's taking from the earth to create that.
Yeah.
So I just think I get a bit stuck on the whole protein thing, because I don't believe in vast fields of soy and like all sorts of those kind of industrialized crops. I just can't see that as being the solution overall. But yeah, you can totally subsist on a vegetarian diet. You don't really need to have meat, but it's just a bit of a tricky one with that for so many people.
Yep. I've been very interested, Jenny, in the conversations we've had, the perspective you bring around your archaeological awareness, how communities fed themselves, and one of the reasons we decided to make this video was you were saying that you don't see some of that information arriving within the sustainability knowledge realms. So there's a lot of talk about sustainable agricultural practices. Is there anything more you want to add on how people have fed themselves in the past that we may get value from the information for planning how to feed ourselves in the future?
Yeah, one of the things that I've been thinking about a little bit lately is the idea of mutualism, which was something that in the past and in Indigenous societies still, although it's sort of starting to die out because a lot of those Indigenous societies are being persuaded to Westernize. The mutualism was a process where people and particular animals would work together to harvest a food that both of them ate.
Oh, really?
So, for example, Aboriginal people here often worked with dolphins to sort of harvest the fish.
Really?
So the dolphins would chase a whole shoal of fish towards, sort of the shore, and then they would be scooped up by people and by the dolphins. And so it was a win-win situation. The same with there are, people who did things with bees and all sorts of other things. So I just sort of see that in order for us to think about ourselves as part of nature again, we need to start thinking about and learning about those kind of mutualism, symbiotic things, because that's actually part of the richness of the tapestry of nature that we were part of, have been part of.
Right.
And I think it's a massive loss when we've done that, because now we're relying entirely on our own resources as far as agriculture. And I also just want to say one thing too about agriculture, and that is the development of agriculture it happened over a long period of time. It was a few thousand years that it sort of just developed. It wasn't a plan. Nobody thought, oh, this is a great idea, this is what we're going to do. No, it just sort of just gradually developed, and the repercussions of that were such that the development of large populations of competitive, of competition and of the building of wealth could happen because people stored that food. And to me, it looks like the cultural restrictions around selfishness broke down.
Right.
Because when you live in a communal society, you're not allowed to be selfish.
Yeah.
It's against the rules. Right?
It's against the rules, but also it's not generated because it's obvious that you're interdependent.
Yeah, that's right. Absolutely. So, and now when we look at, that Fertile Crescent,
Mhm.
it's not fertile anymore. The breadbasket of the world is not
Yeah.
anymore. So I think when we think about food and growing food and being able to harvest food, however we do it, it has to be done in a regenerative manner, in a increasing the biodiversity manner, because when we try to control it like we do with crops,
Yeah.
annual crops, that's where we've come unstuck,
Yeah.
as far as I can see.
Yeah.
So
Created as many problems as we've solved.
Yeah. Yeah, well, those big fields of crops are like food deserts because there's no biodiversity, not no, but there's much less biodiversity in there, and it's a monoculture.
Yeah.
And that's not actually resilient at all.
Yeah.
So I think the idea of mosaic landscapes is a good one, and it can be practiced on a very small scale.
Right. So people could develop
to
that
very
in
large.
their neighborhoods.
Yeah, totally. I mean, the verge of, every street has either a front garden or a back garden, and then maybe a little verge or an edge of the street. Plant things in there. Don't make it a lawn. Lawn is just green desert. It doesn't need to be there.
Yeah.
Put plants in there, let them grow, see if they flourish, and make them things you can eat. There are so many flowers you can eat, and so many plants that have other abilities, like medicinal abilities, and the ability to be soap, and the ability to be all sorts of things. Let's just spread them around, get generous with them. Be a guerrilla gardener. I think about the hedgerows, the traditional hedgerows, and they were really biodiverse as well. They were a bit of a mix of different things, whatever people thought were useful.
Right.
They would put it in. I mean, they were a farming invention as well, but it was more like a little mini strip of forest, on the edge of a field. So, but there can be all sorts of fruit and all sorts of things, nuts and things in there.
I've no idea if this video will be seen by many people, if it will resonate with many people, if it'll make much difference to anything, but it would be my wish that it plants seeds, if you'll forgive the obvious analogies, plant seeds in people's minds to look at the priorities, to make preparations on a community level, not an individual level, and to take on the adjustments in values that it takes. I think I have nothing more to add. Do you have anything more you wish to add?
Oh, probably, but I can't remember it. So Yep, that's it.
Well, thank you for
Mm.
doing this.
That's all right.
Mm.
I love talking about it. If you feel like having another chat another time, I'd be very happy to.
I'm sure we shall. All right. I wish you the best.
Thank you.